Hi, everybody. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain. And what we are going to do this week is we are going to learn about the din of Yakir, the law of a father being believed when he says that his son is not his, when he says that a certain son of his is a Bechor, when he says that his son is a mamzer, when he says that his son is born of a mother who was divorced or born of a mother who had chalitza, and it comes from Devarim Perikaf Aleph, Pasuk Yud Zayin. That section of the Torah is talking about a man who is married to two women, one of whom he loves, the other of whom he hates, and very echoing the language of Yaakov with Rachel and Leah. And let's say, similar to the actual story of Rachel and Leah, that his firstborn son is born to the woman he quote unquote hates. Um, Even if his firstborn son, we might call him Reuven, is born to the woman that he hates, he still has to give that eldest born Pishnayim double portion. Now, just on the words love and hate, often in the Torah, love and hate actually refer more to loyalty and disloyalty. So I do wonder when we call a woman ahuva, beloved, or a woman snu'ah, hated, whether it's uh, Leah talking about herself in Breshit or the Torah talking about this theoretical situation of a man married to a woman whom he loves and a woman whom he hates. I wonder if this is also a little bit more about a woman to whom he feels incredibly loyal and a woman to whom he does not. But either way, the way that the Torah describes what a man has to do in this scenario is Devarim Kaf Aleph Yud Zayin, Ki et habechor ben hasnua Yakir. He must recognize the eldest born son who is born to the wife that he feels less loyalty to. Latet lo pishnayim, to give him double, b'chol asher yimatzeh lo, of all his possessions, kihu reshit ono, lo mishpat habechora, because this child is indeed the firstborn. Now, this term of Yakir recognize the Gemara originally in Kiddushin and then in Bava Batra, Kuf Kaf Zayin Amud Bet, which is why we're talking about it now, understands Yakir to be not just I recognize you as a firstborn for myself, but Yakirenu Lachirim. I uh, almost I offer you that recognition in the face of others as well. And this, from here, the Gemara learns that the father has the possibility of determining by his recognition, declaration, as it were, determining whether his son is considered his, or his son is considered a mamzer, or his son is considered one of these other things. Now, how this comes from the pasuk is interesting. Some people suggest that the way it comes from the pasuk is, look, if the father is believed to say who his bechor is, why isn't he believed to say his son is a mamzer? Other people think of it as, well, if a father is empowered to say who the bechor is, and let's say he says the second son is a bechor, well, then we start to wonder things about the first son. Where's the first son from? So by implication, the son may be a Bechor. Another way that people learn this from the Pasuk is just from the terminology Ben Hasnua Yakir. He is going to recognize the son of the hated wife. And Ben Hasnua, maybe what we're talking about is the son of a bad marriage. And maybe we're not even talking about Mamzerut, but maybe the father was married to a Mamzeret and he wasn't supposed to be, right? So her child is a Mamzer. But Snu'ah here may mean a bad marriage. But either way, it's a really It's a really intriguing and serious power that is given to the father. And I think it's very easy to see how such a power might be misused. For instance, claiming something in order to implicate the mother, or claiming something in order to not have to pay child support, et cetera, et cetera. But it's also kind of fascinating to me that when you look in the Chuvot, in the responsa literature, there actually are places where this power of the father to be able to say, maybe not that his son is a mamzer, but at least that his son is not his, is actually something that could be very beneficial to a situation. And I want to start with that example in a minute. And then, knowing that this is something that could actually be misused, I want to look at some of the qualifications, the limitations that are placed on this by poskim over time, some of them coming out of the Gemara itself, some of them coming out of responsa literature. But first, let's just see an interesting example in the Khatam Sofer, where actually this is an incredibly useful um, ability of the father, and we're not worried about the abuse of it. If anything, we may be relieved when he can use it. So I actually put here, the original Mishnah in Kiddushin, Perek Daled Mishnah Chet, where the discussion of this question of a father saying, "My son is a mamzer," is he believed or not believed? Because that's where it really comes from. And the Gemara there is then echoed in Bava Batra, Kof Kaf Zayin Amud Bet. But here's the Khatam Sofer in Eben Ezer, Siman Ein Vav. Uvda hachi hava bi'ish echad dar bikfar hasamach lihikila kidosh ashtabatish. It's a guy who lived near this particular community. Imishto vanav kulam muchzakim b'cheskat panav mamish. He was married to a woman and he had his sons, and everybody thought his sons were his biological sons, Shema Vihem, and they signed their name based, using their father, Ben Eliyahu, were sons of Eliyahu. For Torah, when they got an Aliyah, they be called up as Ben Eliyahu. But something interesting happened to twist. Avram ben Eliyahu. So the eldest son, Avram, went ahead, v'nasa achot aviv, and he married his father's sister. That's a no-no. That's an Isser Doraita. That's an Erefa Doraita. And he married her b'chuppah v'kiddushin, proper wedding. V'achar kach, and afterwards, after that, the people living in the village were sort of like, wait a second. Be'omram, he says, Ki hu nichshal be'erefa doraita lisatu dato. What do you mean he just married his aunt? B'nishma hadavar laharav so-and-so in Sabatish. And I guess, they're in this kfar, this little village that doesn't have a big rabbinic presence, but they live near Sabatish, and there's a big Gaon who lives in Sabatish, and the big Gaon hears about it. Bekaralav, and he calls this guy Eliyahu in, V'amarle, echni hadavar razeh, this is terrible. V'yeshiv shezeh Avram enu beno. And what does the father say? He's not really my son. Avram's not really my blood son, I should say. Ki imcharko ben ishto. He's my stepson. ואמר אליו הרב הישמע שהחורג יחתום עצמו בשם בעל אמו ויעלה כן לספר תורה וגם בכתיב יכתב בן אברהם בן אליהו. What do you mean? But I've never seen this, that the stepson would be called to the Torah with his stepfather's name, that the stepson would sign his name with your name. What? This doesn't make sense. Ve'eshiv alav hanal, or ve'eshiv Eliyahu hanal, and Eliyahu's answered, Shish'al ishto v'hitashiv, ask my wife, right? Which, it's actually a very tsanua thing. He doesn't want to embarrass her, because what happens is he asks her, and she says, Shebiotap Nuya, when she was single, Hartali's Nunim, she had a baby out of wedlock. Haben, and she gave birth to this Avraham, and he was brought up in some Malamad's house. And then when she got married, she asked this guy Eliyahu, Kedei lahastir boshta, to keep, to hide her embarrassment. Achziku aben ki iluhu mibala. They pretended they made it seem like Avram was Eliyahu's kid. Um, so it's actually an interesting thing. In this situation, it's not, the Khatam Sofer actually ends up being Machmir because he's worried about the Arayot issue. But you know, what's interesting here is the father being able to say, this is not my son is actually incredibly helpful. So it just tells you something. Sometimes there are things that are prone to misuse. The truth is, the Khatam Sofer was worried that there was misuse here just to defend the son. But the point is, it can go in lots of directions. But either way, let's spend a little bit of time talking about the qualifications and the limitations, right? And I'm going to go through three types of limitations, and some of them come right from the Gemara. Some of them come from responsive literature on the basis of something that came earlier in the Gemara, but really interesting. The first type is, who is the father allowed to impact by saying his son is a mamzer? And the Gemara in Yevamot on Daf Mem Zayin, coming off of actually a Yerushalmi in Kiddushin, which is very hard to read, which is why I'm not bringing that. Like it's a little bit confusing. The Mepharshim kind of flip around things in order to understand it. But the Gemara in Yevamot, the Bavli, is much clearer. Gemara in Yevamot says, "Maaseh be'echad sheba lifnei Rabbi Yehuda." Someone comes before Rabbi Yehuda, "V'amar lo nitkayarti b'ni l'vein atzmi." I converted on my own. Amar lo Rabbi Yehuda, yesh lecha edim, do you have any witnesses? Amar le lav, he says, no. Yesh lecha banim, do you have children? Amar lo hain, he says, yes, I do. Amar lo ne'eman ata lifsolat atzmecha, you can passel yourself, yeta ne'eman lifsolat banecha, right? You cannot passel your children, right? So let's leave this kind of esoteric. It's not esoteric, but let's leave this issue, which seems to be about gear, because what comes next is actually where we want to go. Ravina Amar Hachika Amar Le. No. This is the story. Yesh Banim. He says, do you have sons? Hain, yes. Yesh Bnei Banim. Do you have grandsons? Hain. Amar Lo. Neman Atalif Sol Banecha. You can passel your sons by telling us something about their lineage. V'yata neman lifsol b'nei banecha. But you can't passel your grandsons, right? So what does this mean? What are the implications? Does that mean he can say that his son is not of good lineage, but it won't impact the grandchildren? Or does it mean because the son has children, he's no longer allowed to say anything to passel his son, or we don't believe him? So Tanya Namiyachi, we learn in a break. Similarly, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Ne'eman Adam Lomar Beno Katan. A father can say something about his katan, his minor son, ve'eneman al b'no hagadol, but not on his adult son. And Rabbi Chia makes something clear. Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Rabbi Yochanan, let me tell you what we mean by katan. Lo katan, katan mamash. I don't mean a minor, as in the kid is below 13. Velo gadol, gadol mamash. And not, I don't mean once the kid is above 13 and a day, you can't passel him. Ella katan v'yesh banim zehu gadol, right? Meaning, even if a boy is only 12, if he is a child, if he has children, that's considered a gadol, meaning the father cannot make comments that are believed about his lineage once he has children. But gadol ve'in lo banim, but even if he's 17 years old, but doesn't have any children, zeu katan, that's still considered a minor for these purposes. In other words, the father can still say something about him. So I think it's kind of interesting and doesn't surprise me, because coming from the pasuk itself, it's the ben that he's able to be makir, right? It's the ben that it's his son that he's able to recognize. But as soon as he starts directly implicating grandchildren who are already here, who already exist in the world, no dice. Now, of course, once somebody implicates their son, they implicate any children that son has. But there seems to be a difference if those children already exist, right? So that's an important limitation, okay? A second type of limitation, not just you can't impact others in addition. And by the way, I'm purposely not mentioning the father's own wife, because once he says his kid's a mamzer, that means his wife, maybe in a particular situation, maybe she's a mamzeret, that's for a different time, right? But suffice it to say, he's not allowed right now to impact his son's children, and therefore saying anything about his son, we don't believe him anymore. A second type of qualification or limitation is if the son is already muhzak as his son, right? Meaning the son is already presumed to be his son. And now he's coming and saying, no, 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 that's not my son. And I want to give two examples of what might be considered muhzak, right? Obviously, you would say, well, it seems like in the Khatam Sofer situation, it seems like the question was this kid Avraham has been called up to the Torah with the name of his father. That's a muhsakut of sorts. But there's two other types of muhsakut here that I want to give as an examples because I think they're so much more minimal, and yet they have a lot of authority to establish muhsakut. So one is from the Chavot Yakir. Even if the father never said, "This is my son," right? Mamish, sorry, like didn't explicitly say that. But rather, this child was presumed to be his father's son with other, you know, based on other words, and loving gestures, right? She'eno agin rak avim beno, that only a father would do to his son, right? Meaning the muhsakut can be established. Not, it doesn't have to be that the father said, "This is my son," but he does loving things to him, hugs, kisses, sweetie, honey, right? I think that's a very sweet thing. And the Tashbit says something that is, it's not that it's sweet, but it is very minimalist also, that establishes a muhsakut. And this is, it's kind of a pretty sad story. The shaila that was asked was basically about a woman who seems to have committed adultery, and the question of at what point is the father believed to say, this kid's a mamzer because I was away on a business trip and there's no way this kid is my kid, right? So toch kidei, within explaining all of this and trying to respond and answer, the Tashbet says, V'halemi kol zeh, something that comes out of this, hu sha'av ne'eman lomar al beno shehu mamzer, that a father is allowed to, he's believed to say that his son is a mamzer, afilu below hakarat bechor, even if it's not part of what seems to be the context of the din of Yakir in the pasuk, where he's telling us who his Behor is, right? Meaning he's just directly saying my son is a mamzer rather than saying my second son is a Behor, right? Va'afilu muchzak be'idim shehu kasher. And even if this son had evidence, right? Halachic evidence, meaning two edim, that he's not a mamzer, we still believe the father, right? That's pretty strong. But where don't we? Ela she'im hu chazak mipi atzmo shehu kasher. But if from the father we've been able to presume that this son is his son, shuv eno yachol leposlo, he may not go back on his word and say, no, 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 actually, this kid is puzzle. Shahatorah lo ha'eminato ela b'dibur rishon, because the Torah only believes the father if it's his first utterance regarding this child, as opposed to the first utterance being the child is kosher and the second utterance being actually, no, the child's not kosher, right? Aval lachzor midiburo, but to renege on what he said about the child being kosher, lo heminato, the Torah didn't believe the father in that situation. Uvinidon zeh, and so in this situation, where there's a woman who's pregnant or gave birth, was pregnant and conception seems to have happened when the father was away. Im kodem shetza'ak habal al ishto shehi mizana. If before the father ever brought a claim against his wife that she was adulterous, ukar ubara, she was known to be pregnant, vinit parsem hadavar shehi meuberet, and everybody knew that she was pregnant. And at that time, he didn't say anything, but it's only later that he said something that this child must be a mamzer and she must have been adulterous. Nir'eh she'eno ne'eman lomar achar kach. It seems that he should not be allowed to say later, she'ena me'uberet mimenu, that she's not pregnant from him. Shekevan sheshatak mitchila, because he was quiet at the beginning, when everybody knew she was pregnant and he didn't say anything then, harehu kimo shechzika hu me'uberet mimenu. It's as though we now have a presumption that she is really, that he basically gave us a chazaka that she is pregnant from him. And because she had that chazaka that she was pregnant from him, he is not believed to say, nope, but I never slept with her, and so the kid should be mamzer. No dice. Sorry. The child was already muhsak as his. Why? Because he didn't make a claim when everybody knew she was pregnant. Now, by the way, between you and me, it's not so hard to say, well, I didn't want to bring this up when she was pregnant. Let her have the baby first. Da, da, da. But that's not the way the tashbetz goes. Once it's muhsak that the child is kasher, the father is no longer believed. So that is a second version of this, you know, histaigut, or qualification, limitation on the din of Yakir. I want to do the third, and this will be the last. So the last one actually goes back to the basic ophi, or the basic character of this concept that we believe the father about his son. Do we believe the father about his son as a type of edut? Or is the belief that we give the father, the credibility that we give the father about his son, not midin edut, but is just a gzerat hakatuv, a scriptural decree? But we shouldn't think of it as edut. Lamai nafkamina, what's the difference between them? Well, let's think about a few aspects of what comes with edut. In order to give edut, you have to be a kosher witness, right? You can't be a Russia, for example. Can't be somebody who violated, a lav and you haven't gotten malkot yet. Can't be someone who's a goslin. Can't be somebody, right? So that's seemingly, that might limit who we're going to believe on this. But on the other hand, if it's edut, you have to say it. You can't take it back once you've said it, right? So there's a little bit gam v'gam in terms of a little more, what's the word I'm looking for? A little more makil, right? Or a little more limiting and a little more rigid. On the other hand, if it's gzerat hakatuv, there's one more thing, right? If it's edut, you can't be no davar. You can't be somebody who has something to gain by saying this thing. So maybe we might have a situation where we see the father has something to gain by saying it, and therefore we won't listen to him, right? So there's a lot. On the other hand, if it's gzerat hakatuv, then we don't have too many limitations on who we're going to listen to, right? It's not, if you're a goslin, we won't listen to you. That's from edut. But on the other hand, you don't have a mitzvah, what we'd call a mitzvah lahagid. You don't have a mitzvah to tell. which is interesting. And that's probably a conversation for Mumsy Root in general, if we ever get to do a shiur on Mumsy Root. And also probably once you say it, that the child is a mamzer, not yours, you may be able to take it back if you can give an amatla, right? If you can give an excuse as to why it was. But on the other hand, even if you're nogea b'davar, we're going to believe you, right? Even if you have something to gain, we may believe you. So there are other limitations that have been placed over time, but I do think it's interesting to consider, when we think about the din itself, what are some of the stop gaps that are put on it? One is not to implicate uh, the son's children if they're alive already. Another, to be pretty high standards, or no, I should say we should be pretty low standards about what it means, how we establish the assumption that this son is his son in good standing. And once we have pretty low standards for that, it will be hard for him to cross those standards and be able to try to undo our assumptions about the child. And three, just figuring out the nature of this thing itself. And I would say, is it edut or is it gzeira katuv? And I would say that there's something almost typological here about the limitations that are being offered, right? The limitation of, well, you're only allowed to affect this person and not those other people, or the limitation of you're only allowed to do this if you're starting from scratch. But if there's already a presumption, you can't go against it because what you're trying to do is undo something as opposed to do something in the first place. Or how do we understand this din itself? I would say there is something typological there in the sense of when we want to think about in general certain dinim and how they are limited. These are kind of three types of questions you might ask in terms of limiting, right? Who's affected? Are you considered like, is there a burden of proof, so to speak? And how do we understand this din in context of the whole structure of halakha? Is there a larger category that this din fits into, which would then impact the way we apply it or don't apply it? So that's just kind of an interesting little side stop. There are other conversations about maybe beit din, standing in for the father, but these I think are pretty basic and pretty typological. So thanks for learning with me, and I look forward to our next year.